The long-awaited final rule is out almost on a Defense Department cybersecurity program. Not yet in effect, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program rule is now at the White House for review. So you might as well get used to the idea. Joining me with an update, attorney Eric Crucius of Holland and Knight. And Eric, I guess the accurate thing to say is this rule is sent over per rulemaking protocol to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
That's right. It's there. We're just waiting for them to review it and release it, and then we'll see all the joys of CMMC come to fruition.
And what do we know about the final rule based on what we saw of the last version of the proposal and comments?
So the programmatic rule came out in December, the day after Christmas. A nice Christmas gift for the entire defense industrial base.
And it was a big one, too.
It was quite lengthy. I confess I did steal some time away from my family I was traveling to print it out and read it. But there were a lot of things that were made clearer in the proposed rule, but there are some things that were left open. I think that we'll see the final rule kind of address.
What are the key takeaways, then, that people need to know, especially small businesses or large businesses that are going to be subject to this? I mean, it applies across the board.
Right. I do think that this demonstrates the Department of Defense's dedication to this rule. They pushed through this very quickly. They got a lot of comments on it, hundreds of comments, and they adjudicated those comments really quickly when you think about it, because the comment period only closed earlier this year, just a few months ago, and they've already gone through all those comments and have now addressed those comments, edited the rule, and sent the final rule over to OIRA for review.
Right, and just by way of our own review, CMMC is a way of ensuring that contractors have in place basic cybersecurity hygiene programs of their own and that they can prove that they have them to the government.
That's right, and depending on the kind of information you hold for the government, it's either a self-certification or a third-party certification, or possibly a DoD certification on top of a third-party certification. So it's a kind of a step-up process through 3 levels.
Right, and the rules apply, or there's different versions of the rule, whether you're a large company, small company, or a subcontractor, and it goes down to the subs of the subs?
It goes all the way down until you get to a commercial off-the-shelf provider, a COTS provider, but it has a broad-based applicability throughout the supply chain. Small businesses will be subject to it, and of course DoD has come under some criticism about the cost for small businesses of the rule, and they've tried to address it by having something like Project Spectrum, which is a portal online that you could look at that has a lot of information for contractors. Also, some techniques that contractors use, small businesses in particular, using a managed service provider, managed security provider, kind of managing the system. There's no need for most small, medium-sized businesses to set up their own bespoke system to be compliant. They could plug into a system that's already been built and just customized for them. And it's not cheap, but it's far less expensive than the alternative.
Well, you would want to have some cybersecurity system in place anyway if you're an operating company with clients, and you could have the potential to be in possession of federal information on your systems.
Exactly. For most companies, it's not just a matter of regulatory compliance. It's also a matter of what's good business practice. And it's hard because these business practices are not cheap. But on the other hand, responding to a cybersecurity incident is very expensive, and the potential lawsuits that can follow, contract cancellations that can follow, are far more expensive than kind of paying up front for good cybersecurity hygiene.
And just what can we expect of the timeline here? The rule is at OIRA for just a few days. What is the protocol for OIRA to review it and release it back to the agency for finalization?
They have 90 days usually to review the rule, so they'll probably take a lot of that 90 days to review it. Then they'll send it back to the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense will then edit it, publish it on the federal, or have it published on the Federal Register. And of course, we're still waiting for the proposed DFARS rule, which is the rule that would actually go into the contracts. That's also at OIRA, and I expect that we'll see that sometime this summer. And that rule was behind the programmatic rule, but I imagine the turnaround for that rule will be quicker. So it will probably catch up to the programmatic rule eventually.
Right, because without the DFAR rule, then there's no teeth in the CMMC rule, basically.
Right. It's just this programmatic rule that lives in the DFAR somewhere, but it's never in a contract. So they eventually need to get it into contracts.
We're speaking with attorney Eric Crucius. He's a partner at Holland and Knight. And with respect to the costs of CMMC, is there any rule of thumb, such as a percentage of your revenues or ratio to sales to the government type of thing that you can, as a company, have some idea what it will cost you?
Unfortunately not. It's going to be highly dependent on where a contractor is right now. If they have been compliant with NIST 800-171 and they have controlled unclassified information, the step up to get a CMMC certification is not that great. It's just a matter of paying an assessor to come in and assess. It's not quite that simple, but that's the major cost there. If a company has really been ignoring these obligations, and even though they've been in contracts for a while now as a self-certification, then the cost is going to be much greater because they have to, pay that tech debt essentially, get up to speed, and then get assessed. So for each company, it's going to be quite different. Obviously, the small businesses are going to bear a brunt of this. They're an important part of the defense industrial base. I'd also add that there are a lot of international companies, too, that do a lot of business with the Department of Defense that are also going to have a high cost and not really a path forward, an understanding about where they'll come out because there aren't assessors necessarily overseas yet. So companies, fairly large contractors that live overseas are going to have to navigate those waters as well.
Right. The DIB extends to places like Finland and Israel and a lot of other northern European countries. All you have to do is walk through the aisles at the Army show, for example, in Washington every year. And wow, I didn't know they made that stuff in Norway.
Right.
But it's all over the place.
It's very true. It's very true. So DoD will hopefully have a way to address that moving forward. It sounds like they're going to work to kind of shore up the international shortfalls that we've seen so far because they recognize, obviously, that that's a very important part of the DIB.
Yeah, so preparation for this has been a long time in coming. I mean, the first CMMC program was envisioned and constituted to some degree during the Trump administration, so it goes back 6-7 years or so now. The assessor base of people that are going to be in demand to assess companies, is that in place as far as we know?
It's getting there. There are assessors that are ready to go. There are C3POs, as they call them, the companies that are able to hire and maintain those assessment teams. There's, depending on when you look, the last time I checked, there were, I think, 53 C3POs, and most of them will have multiple assessment teams. That's still not a lot for the amount of companies in a DIB that will need a third-party assessment. DoD estimates more than 76,000 will need an assessment. So obviously it's going to require a slower rollout of the program to enable companies in the supply chain to be able to get assessed. There is a voluntary program now, a joint surveillance program that's happening where you get assessed now. Your assessment converts to a CMMC Level 2 assessment, and that's what a lot of companies are choosing to do so they don't get caught up in the crush that can happen when the rule comes out. The downside of that is that if the rule never comes out, you've wasted your money getting an assessment. Or the time starts right now. So an assessment is good for 3 years. If you get a joint surveillance, say September 1st, that clock starts running on September 1st, not when the rule is in effect. To most companies, that's a small price to pay. So there are a lot of folks that are out there inquiring about getting joint surveillance, and they've done dozens of them now. So it's a fairly successful program.
Right, so every third year means you're not unduly burdened by an assessment process year after year after year, but it also runs the risk that you might forget, if staff turns over. What's this thing? We did this 3 years ago.
Right. Yeah, and you certainly don't want to forget because it is a go, no-go. If you don't have that assessment and the clauses in your contract and it's required, you can't perform the work. So that's a great point. It's really great to have policies and procedures in place that will kind of be there no matter who's in that chair responsible for that assessment. Which
means there is some burden incumbent on the government because once that DFAR rule is in place, and if it's for a certain number of contracts, it's going to have to get into the contract writing systems.
That's right. Yeah, the government's going to really have to, Department of Defense specifically, going to really have to ramp up and understand when this goes into contracts, when it doesn't. What level, of course, contractors are going to be required to have to perform the work, and that's going to be dependent on the kind of information they have. So there'll be on a contract-by-contract basis some kind of determination as far as is this applicable, what level is going to be required. I imagine that will be the subject of some protests as well, pre-award protests, where contractors are going to say, no, there's no CUI in here, it's only level 1 required. And maybe that contractor's arguing that because they don't have a level 2 assessment just yet.
And does this apply ultimately to every vendor or just certain ones? That is to say, does it apply CMMC certification for, say, I'm delivering 10,000 eggs from the free-range farms to an aircraft carrier, or only to people making ordnance, command and control systems, electronics, that kind of thing?
It's going to apply to